So the H1B controversy has been kind of continuing to slowly boil around along. Sam Hyde made a very interesting video, made some very good points on the H1B controversy that's going on with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. In short, the H1B visas were kind of mischaracterized as a tool to keep Americans competitive by bringing the best and brightest from around the world. In practice, they're bringing in cheap labor to all levels of the economy. Ultimately, all three parties, Sam, Vivek, and Elon, I think are much closer to each other than they might realize. Um, Hyde's video is very poignant, very humorous, brings up a lot of good points, and it's really worth a watch. I highly recommend it. Um, Two things Sam said that really resonated with me was first, he talked about how many people, he cited Ben Shapiro, kind of singling him out, that America is an idea. And he says, no, America is not an idea. America is its people. And he kind of gets into this idea that, like, you can't just take anybody from anywhere and kind of upload them with the right information and suddenly they're an American. Also, Sam Hyde says people are not interchangeable economic units. He went in and talked about how, like, no one suggests solving the Japanese birth crisis by importing Indians to replace the Japanese who are replacing. He brings up the idea that if China is our greatest competitor, why isn't China importing Indians to counter the greatness of whatever it is Indians bring to this country? The crux of the debate, I believe, comes down to what is America? What is an American? How do you make immigrants American without them altering our culture more than we change them? Obviously, immigrants have an impact on our culture, and for the most part, it's been good. But do we want them to influence us more than we influence them? How do we get technical expertise to power the next wave of innovation? Now, I think everything Sam, Elon, and Vivek talk about in culture, in fact, comes down to education. Education is foundational to culture. Controlling education controls the culture. Vivek brings up the idea that, like, the Japanese and Korean schools have this hyper educational competitiveness that allows them to have uh, better outcomes on math and science. But this comes from the country controlling the education of their own countries. They have deliberately picked that as an outcome. This is the culture they have chosen to instill. Our culture is, to a certain extent, wrapped around this idea of the homecoming queen and the football captain. And these items in themselves are not bad. We've had these concepts as far back as the turn of the 20th century, and really the outcomes of our schools were much better back then. You can't blame those directly, but are we going to defend that to our own detriment? If immigrates assimilate or not is a function of education. A culture of mediocrity versus a culture of excellence comes from education. Universal culture concepts come from education. National citizens or global citizens, individuals or collectives, norms or deviancy. It all comes down to education. Now, the first schools in America from the late 1700s to early 1800s, the school system wasn't much of a system at all. There was no hierarchy and no standards. The schools would tend to form around the community standards of which Christian denomination had set it up. These schools would tend towards sectarian rather than nationalistic themes. Uh, Thus, their regions, their ethnic origins, and of course, the denomination they were from would have a huge impact on all this. Nationalism at the time was actually very anemic, even compared to what we would see now, considering a huge split between the idea of being nationalistic. Individuality was a thing within community norms. America's literacy rates were actually much higher than England's at this time. Despite so many school types, the students from very different locations and beliefs would actually have quite similar outcomes. Part of this being a core element of every education was the Bible, despite denominational differences. This would make core beliefs very similar. Also consider academic material. In 1800, there were at best a few thousand unique book titles in the English language. Many of these would be out of reach of the schools, so this would limit the types of ideas that could be introduced. Only books that were in numbers or popular or relatively easy to get would be something that would be taught from. The next period that would dominate American education would be through the early 1800s. Traces of this would continue all the way through World War I. This is a period where very different groups of people flocked to the US, and the schools were for the most part decentralized. Probably one of the bigger groups starting to come in at this time would be the Irish. In this time period, we'd see competing ideology at the local level. Catholic and Jewish schools would start to spring up. Many ethnicities would start schools taught in the language of their immigrant parents. The results were still high literacy. Uh, there was a diverging, yet still fairly similar form of culture, where Americans generally recognize, walking from one community to the next, you knew you were in an American town. Individuality, again, was based on what you wanted to do within community norms, and once again, a very anemic form of nationalism. Just to characterize the idea of what level nationalism was at this time, we're looking at both a period where New England threatened to secede due to the War of 1812, and we also had a situation where South Carolina, very early on, threatened to secede over tariffs. So the idea of America above all wasn't in the mindset, but definitely there was a strong feeling that we were all Americans of some sort. Now, the 1840s would see the beginning of the rise of the Prussian school system under Horace Mann. The process of converting the whole of the American school system would probably take until about the late 1800s, but a lot of it would be in place by the Civil War. The Prussian system was designed to take disparate German subcultures and mold them into one. At that time period, prior to the implementation of the Prussian system there, the Germans had been subdivided into some 400 minor German states that all had their slight cultural differences. Molding them together into one empire took some work, and the school system was the primary driver that made it work. The Prussian system was designed to subordinate the individual to the state and make the students good soldiers and factory workers. Horace Mann understood this. You can see it from his writings. He viewed what they were doing on location and decided it was quite good. He knew what their goals were, and he wanted their goals to be our goals. His goal was to also in amongst those was to subordinate all religious teaching under a vague milquetoast Protestantism. So, various prayers and biblical teachings were allowed that were somewhat non denominational, definitely meant to kind of push down Catholicism while raising certain elements of Eastern Seaboard Protestantism as a more dominant force. He wanted to mold good Republican citizens who were grateful for the governance of their nation and who'd be willing to sacrifice for that nation when the time came. The Man-Prussian system was designed to stamp out overt individuality and to transform the children of immigrants into American citizens. Academically, it fared slightly worse than the old system. Oddly, kind of almost ironically, if I'm using it correctly, uh, Horace Mann had a problem with the method of teaching reading at the time, instilled his own ideas, which actually decreased our literacy rates. And his ideas would stick hard until well into the 1900s. But overall, the Prussian system in America stressed American nationalism through its teaching of history, the idea of binding us under one nation, etc., etc. Now, I'm going to break briefly from the historical progress here to explain a critical item we need to understand about our educational system, and that's teachers. People who want to be teachers are inevitably some form of ideologue. They either agree with the goals of the system and want to further it, or they are subversive and work to or are allowed to infiltrate it. Now, the Prussian system hummed along with relative ease through the end of the 1800s into the 1930s. Each state had slightly differing views on how much control to exert, and the federal government's reach was very minimal. Remember me talking about teachers being ideologues? Well, the progressives, the socialists, and the New Dealers and the communists added themselves to the teaching ranks, beginning a slow slide from academics and nationalism towards mediocrity and radical causes. Eisenhower would eventually deal with what he saw as a problem of Americans not being able to compete with the Soviets due to Sputnik. In order to keep pace with the Soviet science, he opened the door to federal involvement in education. Essentially, this allowed ideological capture of the local schools could be enhanced by ideological capture of the state and federal bureaucracies that were dedicated to education. If you could control the school at all levels, you could dictate methods and outcomes. Not only could you dictate methods and outcomes, you could force them to be used on a state level or even a national level. To put it short, Eisenhower, with good intentions, to try to make math and science work better in this country, opened the door for everybody to put their stamp on education. Now, the problem with implementing a Musk model or a Vivek model or a Sam Hyde model of education is that as long as our system is centralized and public, it's open to capture. So even if you fix things, it's almost inevitable where we're going to end up back here where we are doing this or something far worse. And the same goes for the Republicans that think we can have, we can basically heave a sigh of relief if the Department of Education goes away. Even if the State Department of Education goes away, there's still going to be some national tendrils into the system, and the state education bureaucracy equivalents will still be in place. The school boards will still be open to capture by radicals. So the answer is that Musk, Vivek, and Sam Hyde are actually all correct, even if we don't know what the Sam Hyde model is. The answer is to implement everything. This is done by going back to complete decentralization. No federal involvement, no state involvement. Disband the districts. This requires at a minimum universal school choice. If a small town wants to keep a public school, then they can vote to keep it. If a private school is created in the way that Vivek envisions, one with no prom queen and no football team, that's dedicated to kick-ass math and science, it will form, and the families who want to will go to it. And we will begin to create, not all of us, but a subset of us who fulfill the idea Vivek has for what will create excellence in this country. If Elon wants to go to Mars, he should be building Musk academies in key locations. That way he can shape and benefit from the next great generation of American technical workers, while they benefit from the experience of his education methods and ultimately being workers in some things that are some of the greatest endeavors mankind might be getting into. And whatever it is Sam Hyde wants to see happen, certainly schools that replicate the values he holds dear could be created in such a system. So the bottom line is the American people, which are the American culture, we have to remember that the education system of America is the primary sculptor of that culture. In order to make things run in a way that's beneficial to everyone, we need to make education look and act in an American manner again. All right, so in the comments below, how many of you saw the Sam Hyde video? What do you think? If you haven't commented on the H1B kerfuffle, please tell me what you think on that. What have you learned? What do you know that sounds different from what I'm saying? Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, check out my other titles. You'll probably find things you like. Subscribe. And if you know someone who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.